Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Sheila Caldwell, Southern Illinois University System Office Vice President for Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer. I would like to welcome you to this year's Conversations of Understanding. We appreciate those of you who are joining us for the first time, as well as those of you who are joining us for our third part in this six-part series focused on results from our 2022 Viewfinder Campus Climate Survey. Again, today, part three, we will focus on the narrative finding, free speech, and diversity of thought. That emerged as a critical theme as we were reviewing comments as well as the data. And I'm going to share momentary findings that specifically contains direct quotes from SIU students, faculty, staff members, as well as administrators. And I think you'll find those findings illuminating. And the person who we have invited here today to help us unpack some of those findings and share her expertise is attorney Michelle Dutchman. She serves as the inaugural executive director for the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. And before I get further into her bio, my first introduction to attorney Dutchman was at the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education International Conference that they had in the UK. And I really appreciated how she was able to really show how free speech, along with diversity of thought, along with anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on campuses can actually be in harmony and not conflict with each other once we really understand how those pieces work together and how, again, they can work in concert. So I was appreciative of that and really wanted her to be here today for you all to be able to enjoy and profit from her knowledge and experiences. The center that she currently manages and oversees explores how the fundamental democratic and academic principles of free speech and civic engagement should enrich the discovery and the transmission of knowledge in America's colleges and universities. And again, we do want to look at free speech and discovery because we are not here to tell our students what to think, but how to think well. And again, that's what she specializes in her role. She also oversees a multidisciplinary national fellowship program and works across all 10 UIC campuses, University of California campuses, to study and shape national discourse about free speech. She earned her Juris Doctorate from University of Southern California Law Center. Michelle Dutchman is also a Phi Beta Kappa graduate at University of California at Berkeley, and she holds a bachelor's degree in political science. She currently teaches a course on contemporary free speech issues at UCLA School of Law. And so I would just like to say thank you so much for being here. And I know we are in for a treat. I also want to thank all of our students, faculty, staff, and administrators who are joining us today via YouTube. We also look forward to engaging you with case studies. So we, throughout the session, she will present case studies and we want our faculty, staff, especially our students, to be able to respond. So please put your questions in the YouTube chat and we will make sure that she gets that information. I also am excited to announce that if you are a student participating in this Conversation of Understanding today, you are eligible to receive 1 clock hour credit towards the Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leadership Certificate. And again, the point of contact on your campus is Ms. Lizzie Wagner, if you are on the Edwardsville campus, and Dr. Renata Greer, if you are a student on the Carbondale campus. So again, do not waste this experience. You can receive credit. And before we get started with learning more from Attorney Dutchman, it is important for me to share context specifically about the findings from our 2020 Viewfinder Campus Climate Survey. And so now at this time, I'm going to share my screen and take about 5 to 7 minutes to share background on why this, again, was a significant finding. Okay. So again, it's worth repeating, and for those of you who have joined in, I do want to make sure those who are joining in for the first time do understand the context. So this survey was sent out to 20,000 students and 7,000 employees from March 14th to April 14th. We specifically sent an anonymous and confidential survey to faculty, staff, and students. And so the comments that are shared today, I have no idea who said them. I just know faculty, staff, and students. I don't know which student, any of that. And so we're not interested in that. We're more so interested, again, in the content and improving our climate. Our aim was to assess perceptions about welcome, sense of belonging in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and in the community. We specifically targeted diverse constituents, including international faculty, racial ethnic groups, people with disabilities, the LGBTIA community, as well as veterans. And then we also reviewed over 40 reports and more than 1,000 comments. And so our goal is to look at the resources that we have available to improve our campus climate, and also to analyze the experiences of all of our faculty, staff, and students, with special emphasis, again, on those groups that I just mentioned. We talked specifically about the themes, the findings, in addition to the quantitative, what were the qualitative, what was the story behind those numbers. We learned that we were experiencing diversity fatigue, and in some cases, racial battle fatigue. Our first conversation of understanding was focused and dedicated to that. You can find that on YouTube. There was concerns about fairness in the hiring and promotion process, and we addressed that last month in October, and we referred to that as the myth of the most qualified applicant. Again, that's uploaded on YouTube if you want to review that, which brings us to today, free speech and diversity of thought. Again, third in our series, specifically focused on our campus climate survey. When we look at the data specifically here, religious and political expression, I think it's also worth noting when we look at our demographic and who particularly completed this survey, 7% of African Americans, 10% Asian Americans, 3% Hispanic, 77% white, 6% international. Also, 22% of our students across our campuses identify as LGBTQIA, and compared to about 7% for faculty and staff. So those numbers are important as we think about who responded to the survey and what was some of their key identities, as well as their intersectional identities. When we specifically focus on religious and political expression, one of the findings, again, was when we talked about religion, is that the majority of our faculty, staff, and students identified as Christian, agnostic, and Catholic. Less than 50% felt that they could express their religious views on campus. And so when we talk about sense of welcome and belonging, this was one of the lower categories. In most cases, we asked people if they feel welcome. It was overall, it was about 65 to 70%, but this category was something that caught our attention because less than 50% felt like they could express religious views on campus, and less than 40% felt like they can express their political views. And we disaggregated by demographics. It was specifically white faculty, staff, and students who were the least likely to report open political expression. And again, I will get into comments about that just in a moment. And so these are some direct comments from students across all of our campuses and their concerns about political and religious expression. First comment, I feel I might say something wrong, or my comments might be taken in the wrong way, so I do not talk about it at all. We're concerned about that. We want students to be able to explore it, to have transmission of knowledge, and to be able to have civil discourse. And that's why we're having this conversation of understanding today. Second comment, I'm a Christian white conservative woman and feel like I can't speak up on anything because of the hate towards Christians here. The one man that came to speak about God and got shoved down, curses thrown at him, very unsafe environment for Christians. Again, these are people experiences that they've had on our campuses. Being a Muslim, I like holidays for Muslims respected and recognized in the academic calendar, prayer spaces in all buildings. As often, there's not time to get to the couple of spaces on campus. So again, we need to expand that, and we will expand those spaces. There is definitely a bias towards people with left-sided views. They seem to be able to voice their ideals without any harm or judgment. Although it's no need for politics and learning, I will actually question that. The many teachers that are left-leaning have voiced their opinions. I have not experienced bias firsthand, although I saw a video circulating of an SIU student claiming to vote for Trump to keep the ends out. Again, that was a comment, a concerning one that was found. Everywhere, because everyone thinks everything is racist today in today's world when it is far from it. As Morgan Freeman said, the only way to stop racism is to stop talking about it. We should live by this. Again, should we? That's a question. And this is a student comment, just one student comment, but it was actually compelling to me, and I thought it was worth us giving due attention to this particular comment. As a white male in this institution, I have not had the same opportunities presented to me as those presented to people of color. I am by no means racist, but this institution has directly targeted people of color and sexual identity for more opportunities inside and outside of the classroom. I feel as though being a white male in this school and in this society, that I have been more qualified and eligible for jobs and scholarships, but due to me being white, I am being discriminated against and have been left in the rear view by this country and its policies. So again, these are concerns beyond SIU. They're looking at the national landscape. And I think that's important to note because we are not unaware that the comments that revealed themselves in our survey were also a microcosm of what's also going on in larger American society. Second part, furthermore, I would like to point out my issues with my religion. And again, we see the politics and the religion being connected in this particular comment. As a Catholic, there are certain things I believe the school does not support because of the backlash they may receive from people's feelings being hurt. This school, along with many others, have softened our generation to the point where I'm even afraid to express my opinions and thoughts because of what others will think and a lack of support this institution and world have given me and many others. Do not think this comment is a joke because I mean it with full sincerity and heart. And whoever wrote this comment, young man, I believe that, and I want you to know that's why, that's one of the reasons why this was shared today, because we know that this is not a joke, that you are not alone in your particular feelings. But again, we have to engage a lot of these ideas that I said here today, because again, free speech is not a joke, and people again should feel free to be able to express their opinions. But we're also going to talk about some of the challenges or consequences or benefits that come along with expressing those opinions. A few more student comments. The only groups I see are white men handing out flyers supporting white Christian supremacy propaganda on campus, and the campus security doing nothing about it. A staff, administration, and student body who refuses to adhere to mask mandate policies because of inconvenience. So again, we see how COVID and free speech also was connected. Second comment, SIU makes sure to make it near impossible to be a white conservative Christian male on this campus. And we see those words a lot, conservative Christian, white. Again, I noticed that connection. I've been treated differently by RAs, TAs, professor, housing staff, dining staff, students, but that does not matter to SIU because standing up for someone like me is not in the agenda. If I get harassed or treated unfairly, it is okay because I'm a white male who has conservative views. I would like to say that is not okay, and that is what the bias incident reporting process is for. I will repeat the bias incident reporting process. Dr. Frazier is the leader on the campus for the Carbondale campus, and we have Ms. Jamie Ball, who serves as the attorney and leader on the Edwardsville campus, as well as attorneys for the School of Medicine as well. Second comment, educators forcing their political views onto students and calling out students for having different political views than them. That was also a comment as well. I want to actually share just a few more student solutions. When people act racist, hold them accountable. Again, that is something that we're putting into our processes because we want everyone to feel included and thrive. Make room for diversity conversations in the classroom. I thought that was a good solution. We do need to have these conversations in the classroom, outside of the classroom. Another comment, allow for dissenting opinions to be heard on campus based on merits and not immediately dismissed. And again, that's when the critical thinking, the cognitive abilities, that comes in because we want you to think well about these conversations, regardless of your opinions and views. We heard from students, now let's hear what our faculty and staff had to say. It is not safe to have conversations with people who do not share your beliefs. People become very aggressive coming back at you if they disagree. Sad, that's a faculty comment. Bias incidents are predominantly from students who write papers that are markedly homophobic and or transphobic. So I want us to think about this. We have students saying that, people are free to express themselves if they are left-leaning or if they identify as LGBTQIA, but then we have a faculty member who is actually concerned about the fact that a lot of the bias incidents are from students who write homophobic and transphobic papers, and this faculty member has to read these papers. The preacher in the quad is given too much leeway, as well as having Chick-fil-A on campus is harassing by definition to the LGBTQIA community. So again, economies of scale. Old white men are perceived to be the source of all world's problems in this culture. New vocabulary is introduced weekly to reflect this paradigm. Toxic masculinity, man-spreading, mansplaining. We are the only group that society are encouraged to discriminate against. I am white and I rarely ever talk about politics or religion at work, so I personally have not experienced much bias. One of the reasons I want to say that the numbers were low when it came to religious and political reviews and political views is because many faculty and staff from all different ethnic backgrounds felt like race and religion should not be discussed at work. And this is just one example of that comment. Another comment, I do not identify as trans, but I have heard some very strong negative comments that could have been considered harassment if a trans person was to have been present. So again, this is a staff member who is listening to a conversation from other staff members who are making anti-trans comments. So when we talk about people feeling like they can't be free, this person was in an environment where people felt very free to express anti-trans comments. And administrative comment, political views should not be brought to the workplace. All faculty administrators should do what is best for SIU and not try to follow a political agenda. Same for all of the topics on this survey. Treat all individuals with respect and work towards a better SIU with excellent programs. And I think that is our goal, is to treat everyone with respect and work towards a better SIU. And obviously we have dissenting opinions on the best way to do that. Because if you're going to improve the climate for everyone, it is important to understand everyone's experience and how they are engaging and interacting with the climate. And until we see what the other person sees and somehow hear what they hear, we really can't in a meaningful way change the climate. And again, that brings us to these topics today. And so now I am going to stop sharing my screen and actually turn it over to Ms. Michelle Dutchman and really have her share legal perspective on how we should be engaging these topics in a way that all members can learn as well as thrive and flourish on our campuses. So thank you, Michelle, for being here today, and we look forward to learning from you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caldwell. I want to thank her and her whole team. I want to start by saying that, I have spent the last 20 years doing different kinds of facilitations of conversations about speech and other issues on campus. And it is very rare to see a university embrace the feelings and expressions of their students, staff, and faculty, and to be so transparent about it. I just want to say that I think that's super courageous. And you're already like way ahead of where a lot of universities are, because all the things that you hit on, I'm writing them down: fear of saying something wrong, feeling unsafe, reticent to share political and religious views, bias for or against certain groups of people, softening of the generation, indoctrination by professors, right? These are not just happening at SIU. These are things, as Dr. Caldwell said, that unfortunately right now, the campuses are just microcosms of the very polarized world that we're living in. And so I think the good news and the bad news is that you aren't alone. And I think what we're going to do, today is I'm going to share the kind of legal framework. But what we're going to see really fast is that the law is a really blunt instrument, and it can't really help us solve all of our problems. That a lot of the issues that we're going to deal with are ones that have to do with interpersonal dialogue and learning how to listen and talk to each other. And so I'm going to start with the very basics. I'm going to assume that most people know this stuff. So I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible, even though I can't see you. I can hear from you through the chat, and I plan to ask questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Before I share my screen, I think the other thing I want to say is I have some issues with the idea of free speech, of that expression. And this is something I've grown in my career to think about, because I think that in some ways free speech is sort of misleading, because first of all, it's not free in the sense that there's a very high cost. So there is an extremely high cost. I will share the screen in a second. There's extremely high cost to free speech in our society, and we know who bears the brunt of that cost. And the other thing I just want to open with is the idea that free speech, I don't want anyone to ever think that means absence of consequences, so that we do have a lot of rights. But one of the things that I think sometimes people forget is that you can use your right to free speech, but then you have to be ready for someone to respond to you. And we can talk about how to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And all right, everyone's looking good? We okay? All right, so I'm going to try to take us through a lot of information fairly quickly. Please feel free to put questions into the chat, and then we're going to get to the case studies. I think the first thing is I want to start with something Dr. Caldwell said, which is that I don't believe that expression, diversity, and inclusion are antithetical to each other. Now, listen, I'm not going to be Pollyanna. Sometimes does freedom of expression and diversity and inclusion, do they sometimes rub and come into tension with each other? Absolutely. But that's a lot of what the Constitution does. And I think that the framework that I like to look at things in is to say, rather than looking at a framework of an either or, right? I don't like all the polling. It's like, let's ask students, which would you rather have? Would you rather have freedom of expression or diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I feel like that's a false choice, because I'd like to believe that you can have both of those things. Maybe not every minute of every day, but that's sort of how I want to go into our discussion, which is about how we can find ways that those all of these institutional values intersect. I want to start with some photos. I don't know if people recognize these photos, and I'm not only showing you these because I went to Berkeley a million years ago. I wasn't there during the free speech movement, but to give you a sense of why the center that I oversee exists. So this was the 1960s, right? It was a time when administrators didn't want students and faculty and others to have rights to protest. And students and others prevailed upon administrators, and they were able to be heard in large portion about the war. And then I'm going to show you a picture also from Berkeley, but this is in 2017. I don't know if people remember, this was the year that Milo Yiannopoulos had one of his tours. And when he came to Berkeley, it resulted in not only property damage and violence. And it started sort of this narrative of there's a free speech crisis on campus and nobody is free to speak, and, the world is falling down. So again, I think that for the most part, free speech is happening on college campuses around the country every day. Now, has the world become increasingly polarized and challenging? Absolutely. And with that, and I think with the advent of social media, which didn't exist when I went to college, there's a lot of, the stakes are very high in terms of speaking to one another and how to respond when are words and ideas that we feel uncomfortable with. And so it was sort of out of this that happened at Berkeley that then President Janet Napolitano, she was the president at UC, she formed the center. And the goal of our center is to explore the intersection of expression, engagement, and democratic learning, and consider what can we do to restore trust in the value of free speech on college campuses and within society at large. So it's a big task. We've been at that task for about 5 years. I want to spend 2 minutes just telling you about some of the things we do. We have a National Fellows Program that faculty, staff, students, undergraduates can apply to. You get a stipend of $20,000 to do research. And these are some of the topics that we have done research on. We have a lot of educational initiatives, all of it free of cost. We have an annual conference. We actually have regular webinars. One of them is today at noon. We have our fellows presenting on their research. We have a podcast called Speech Matters. Again, trying to focus on these really challenging issues and dive deep into them. I'm sort of into nuance. I'm the antithesis of Twitter. I can't say anything in 250 characters, right? I want to be having us think deeply and really intentionally about these things. And of course, we have all kinds of other resources, and I'm hopeful that Dr. Caldwell and her team will send out a link to the center so that you can access all of these things. But more, to the issue at large. So here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So my first question is my first question for the group. Comments from YouTube. Freedom of expression does not mean freedom from consequences. I absolutely agree. It is not free. You have to be ready to accept responsibility for what you say. So I have a question. I'm giving you one clue here. You know that the First Amendment covers freedom of speech. Does anybody know the other 4 rights that are covered? And you can just drop those into the chat, and Doris can let me know. And the reason I ask this question is because there's a lot of data that shows that most adults in America actually don't know all of the rights that are covered by the First Amendment. And so I think that therein begins the problem, which is that, it's hard to have conversations about what freedom of speech means in society and in a public university if most people aren't even sure what those rights are. So I don't know if there was any answers. I'll give you another minute. Before I give clues. Can be dropping them in. I think what I will do is while I wait, I just want to mention why the First Amendment says Congress. The reason it says Congress is because at the time that was how it was written. It has then become interpreted to mean any form of government. So that's state government, that's local government. And guess what? At a public university, SIU is an arm of the government. One of the things that I think a lot of people are often confused by is this idea of the First Amendment and this issue of government. So the First Amendment, social media platforms, they don't have to abide by the First Amendment. They are private companies, right? And they get to make their own decisions about what goes on their platform and what does not go on their platform, okay? When we're talking about the First Amendment, we're really talking about government. The idea is we don't want government to be able to censor us or to retaliate against us because of our speech. So that's why it says Congress, and you're going to keep that in mind as we go through. Okay, so let's see. Great. I got religion, gather peaceably, and petition the government for redress. I'm very impressed because most people don't get petition. So here we go. Congress shall make no law. There we have religion. And I think one of the things that there's a professor at NYU named Bert Newborn who has this kind of theory of why the Constitution was written this way. And so when you start with religion, right? What is religion? It's largely beliefs, right? And then you maybe take those beliefs and you share them. That's your use of speech. So you communicate your beliefs with others, right? And then maybe you want to go to the next step, which at the time was the printing press, right? And you want to share your beliefs more widely with people outside of your community. So that's the press, right? And then there's the next piece, which is after you've shared your beliefs widely, you want to be able to bring people together in one place to assemble peacefully, to be able to protest or share your grievance. And then the last one, which is really kind of the pinnacle of challenging the government, is to say to the government, hey, you have wronged us and we need you to make it right. So today we're going to obviously be focusing on the speech piece of it, but I want to just give you context about the entire First Amendment. All right, what counts as speech? It's not just the words we say, right? It's music, it's accessories, it's jewelry, it's clothing, it's our writing. And then I have a picture of an American flag burning because there's also something called expressive conduct. So if you were to go to a public park and burn an American flag, even if you don't say a word, it's considered speech because you are sharing a viewpoint in the action. And so there's certain things like that also that count as speech. 1 second. There we go. Okay, can you say anything you want? I think we all know that the answer is no. And I'm going to argue that I think that's probably a good thing, or at least for me. I don't think I would have gotten this far in life if I said everything that I thought in my mind. And again, I think this goes back to the idea of rights versus responsibilities, which I think is a really big part of thinking about what it means to be part of a university community. That just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean that that's a good choice. And so I'm going to say something that people might find a little bit controversial, which is that I don't think that self-censorship is always bad. Now, do I think it's concerning when 50% of people say that they're hesitant to share their political views? Absolutely. But do I always think that it's bad to make choices about what you're going to say? No, I think that's part of an environment in which we're going to learn and grow. And I think it's really important that people be able to make mistakes, and that includes saying something wrong. And I think it's really hard to be going to, college and feeling like you can't say something wrong for fear that you'll be retaliated against, because, right, if you can't fail, then you can't grow. So really fast, I want to go over the kind of speech that is not protected. So most of what we're going to talk about today is speech that is protected. This is a short list of speech that's not protected. And I would say the things that come up most often probably on campus would be threats and potentially harassment, both which have very specific legal definitions. So it's possible that someone might say something to you that feels very menacing, very intimidating, and very threatening, but it may not rise to the level of an actual legal threat. Same thing with harassment. But really our focus today is I want to focus on the speech that is protected, especially maybe the speech that makes people uncomfortable, so that we can talk about how we respond to that kind of speech within your SIU community. So, true or false? Hate speech is not free speech. And I'm going to wait a minute for people to put their vote in, because I think this is a really key point. I'm going to have a sip of water while you just need to put into the chat, you're voting true, you're voting false. And I'll give you a sec. Oops. All right. Let me give people a minute. Okay. So for those of you that put it in, the answer is this poster is actually false. Hate speech is free speech. Now, people may not like the fact that hateful speech is protected under the First Amendment, and we can argue about whether it should be or it shouldn't be. But the reality is, like, this is what our constitutional jurisprudence says. And we're going to work in that paradigm of people can come onto campus and say really offensive and ugly things on the left and on the right, and the university isn't going to be able to stop them. Okay. And so I think the first question becomes, right, is there a legal definition of hate speech? And I'm going to give you the answer and say the answer is no. Okay. So, and the reason that there's no definition of hateful speech is because it's very subjective. Right? If we were all in a room together, I would ask all of you to take out a piece of paper and write down your definition of hate speech. And I can promise you that although the whole group today might agree on a couple of things, they're going to start to diverge because it's very subjective. And I don't know if this, it's a kind of a silly example, but I went to see Book of Mormon. This is like the musical, like pre-COVID. And I think I was sitting in a theater in Los Angeles with, I don't know, 1,500 people. And I think I was the only person who wasn't laughing. And that's because I found it really deeply offensive. And again, you know, the question is, you know, so it's subjective, and we have to go back to the government. Remember, the First Amendment's about the government. And so the question becomes, do you want the government to be able to define what is hateful or offensive or ugly or demeaning? And I think the answer to that is no, because we never want people in power, I think, to have the ability to decide what can be said and what cannot be said. Because if you think back to the past a little bit, there's a lot of social and political movements that have been able to succeed in large part because of the First Amendment. I'm not saying that it was always easy for it to happen. I'm not saying that sometimes law enforcement didn't try to stand in their way, or government, but ultimately, everything from women's suffrage to the civil rights movement, to the anti-draft movement, to the gay rights movement, marriage equality, Dreamers, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all of these movements would not have been able to succeed without the First Amendment. Because at the time, right, the idea of women voting, a lot of people at the time thought that was a really dangerous idea, and they would have preferred women to stay unempowered. Same thing for a lot of these groups. And so I just want to keep people to remember that ultimately, I do believe that even though the First Amendment has its flaws, it is the best system that we've got. So I see some questions. Okay, so if hateful speech includes a threat to someone, then it would be unprotected. So really the way I think about it is protected and unprotected speech. So if I say to Dr. Caldwell, I know where you live and I have an intention of coming to your house and, you know, hurting you, that would probably be considered specific enough to be a threat. And right, that's not going to be protected speech. Someone could say to me, hey, you cannot continue to say that any longer. But in terms of things people just find ugly or offensive, targeting groups generally, those kinds of things are allowed. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. Just want to share this quote that I really like that says, the framers of the Constitution knew that free speech is the friend of change and revolution, but they also know that it's the deadliest enemy of tyranny. Okay, and there are other countries in the world that do punish speech. So for instance, like in places in Europe, if you engage in Holocaust denial, you can be sanctioned by the government. And again, I'm not an international lawyer, but I don't believe that those countries have any less hateful or offensive speech because people can get punished. I'm very into like sunshine is the best disinfectant. I think it's better for views to be out in the open where people can know about them and respond to them than to go underground. Okay, so, but hate speech hurts. And I want to just make sure I acknowledge that when we're talking about the First Amendment and free speech, there's a big cost to be borne by society. And we know that that cost is largely borne by marginalized groups. And I think the hard part is the argument that then says, even though that's deeply unfortunate, like, is it still valuable? And I think that despite the impact of hateful speech, it is still valuable in the sense that it helps really preserve ultimately freedom for everyone. And I'm going to give an example of sort of be careful what you wish for. So in the 1980s, University of Michigan and a lot of universities around the country passed hate speech codes. So there was a lot of anti-Black sentiment on campuses. And so they passed these speech codes that basically said, on University of Michigan's campus, you cannot say anything that will offend, demean, hurt someone based on their, race, religion, national origin, ethnicity, LGBT status, etc. Okay. But the problem with those laws was that they were really vague. And people didn't know, well, what will be considered offensive? So they were afraid to speak. So it resulted in a chilling effect on campus. And ultimately, University of Michigan was sued. And the case went to court. And the court said, sorry, these hate speech codes don't work. They're too vague. They're too ambiguous. They're too subjective. The interesting thing I find is that in the 1 year that they were in effect, the goal of those hate speech codes were largely to protect students, particularly Black students. But guess who got charged under those hate speech codes? 19 Black students were charged, but no white students were charged. And I'm not saying that that's always the case, but I show that as an example that we have to be careful what we wish for, and that sometimes when we think censorship will be our friend, ultimately it is not. So let's think about responding to hateful speech. I'd love to hear some ideas from people in the chat about if you are confronted, whether you are walking to class, passing by the preacher that somebody mentioned, listening to some water cooler conversation, whether there's an article in the school newspaper or a flyer that's hanging that really speaks to you in a way that makes you feel fill in your emotion. What are some things that people can do to respond to hateful speech? And while I wait, I'm going to just put in, I'm going to share a couple of things. And one of them is this idea that everybody on campus has a voice. Everybody on campus has a voice. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to use your voice, right? Part of free speech is being able to remain silent. But I think one of the things I want to ask you all to think about, especially after today's, workshop together, is how often do you use your voice and when do you use it in the face of ugly words? So I think individuals have a responsibility, but I also think the university has a responsibility. And it's clear to me that, Dr. Caldwell and the administration of the university take very seriously their responsibility. And I would hope that they would use their institutional voice if and when something were to happen on campus that impacts the campus climate or community. You want to respond directly and you want to respond clearly with timely statements. And also you really want to, I always say, you really want to name the hate, right? These general statements that just say hate is bad, that's not going to cut it. You need to speak to the specific group that has been targeted and make sure that people know that they are welcome and that they are safe. I'm going to just take a minute. I love some of the answers coming in. So Okay, I see a good question about spaces from harassment, and we will get to that. But I want to stick with responses. So one is counter protest, open forum to discuss differences. I think that's a great idea. You can, respond with more speech, whether that's a counter protest or whether that is a discussion. Or I would even say sometimes you might not want to give attention to a person who's coming with a message that you find offensive. So rather than counter protest, another option would be do a different event at the same time, but in a different location. So if someone is coming onto campus to talk about how they don't think that the United States should let in any more immigrants from other countries, instead of protesting that speaker potentially and giving more attention to that speaker, you could also have like a diversity event somewhere else on campus that talks about how international your student body is. There's lots of things that you can do. Reinforce campus values and trajectory. I think that's a great answer. And the different ways that you can reinforce campus values are, again, by institutional speech, by putting on events, by creating spaces for people to talk to each other. Good answer here, mediation between individuals to help them have difficult conversations. I think that's right. I think that one of the problems, at least in my humble opinion, is that we're not giving young people, and I mean, I'm a parent and I have young kids, I'm not sure that we're giving them the tools for how to have difficult conversations with people. I feel like at our dinner table, we talk all the time about words and how powerful they are and what the impact of words are, and, be careful with your words. But the problem is if you don't pair all of those skills with the other skill of, in certain situations, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have to hear what other people have to say. And you're going to be in situations where you need to be able to respond in a way that's reasonable and not just shouting the other person down. If we only give young people one set of skills and then we drop them off in a community like SIU or Berkeley or Michigan, wherever it is, and all of a sudden there's all of these people coming with ideas that are really deeply offensive, and all we've taught them to do is to respond, then we shouldn't be surprised when their response is like, shut this speaker down, because learning how to talk across difference is a skill, just like writing an essay or learning a math equation or speaking a language. And so I think that's really important. Okay, seek people who are from similar locations as you, so you have some reprieve from the hate and you know that you are sane. Yes, I think that doing a sanity check is always really important, and finding people that you can connect with to discuss the impact of the speech and how you want to respond to it. Gather people who are like-minded with a different and more inclusive message. That's great. Someone wrote, I do DEI training. I believe in my heart and soul that if we don't know how to talk through difficult concepts, we'll never overcome these issues. Well, I absolutely agree. I feel like all of you could be giving this course. And I think that that's a big part of what's happening, is that these issues start way before people come to college, right? This is like, we need to be teaching students in elementary, middle, and high school how to talk across difference and how to articulate yourself and how to do it in a way that's both like effective without screaming. And so, but I can't solve the whole secondary and higher education situation now. So we're going to focus on what folks can do in the university system. And I just have a couple of pictures here. From one of our fellows who spent their year talking about effective ways to respond to hateful speech. These are from UC Santa Barbara. So the first is t-shirts. There was a speaker that was coming that a number of the students felt was very offensive. And so they printed t-shirts, exclusion is ignorance, hate-free UCSB, and people wore the t-shirts, and they also handed out stickers. And so again, it was the idea of a different and more inclusive message. So rather than saying, let's focus on trying to stop the speaker, which isn't constitutionally allowed, or protesting and giving him more attention, let's have a different message that we can share. And then another favorite one of mine, it's actually, this is something I've seen a couple of times. This most recently from, I can't remember, I'm sorry, which state it was. There was an LGBT Q kind of fair, and some people came to protest, basically the existence of LGBTQ people. And the protesters came in as angels. And so when they lifted up their wings, they basically made it so that the people on the stage could no longer see the kind of like ugly and offensive signs that were being shown. And I thought it was just a very unique way of sending a certain kind of message, not just the wingspan, but the idea of protection. So I think there are a lot of creative things that people can do. So what is one thing, though, that we cannot do that is not constitutionally permissible? So protest is allowed. It is encouraged. It is essential. I think part of like living in our republic. Something called the heckler's veto is something that has become more popular on college campuses, unfortunately. And that's when people are so disruptive that protesters preclude the speaker from being heard. Okay. Guess what? That is not protected by the First Amendment, okay? The idea is not that you go and you yell so loud that no one can hear the speaker. That is considered unprotected speech. It is considered disruption. And if I'm guessing, there's probably some code of conduct violations that take place. So not only is it not constitutional, but going back to the idea of the university, which is to like transmit knowledge and create knowledge and exchange ideas. We can't do that if we're shutting people down. And I think it's also important to remember that it's not just about the right of the speaker and the right of the protesters. There's also the audience, and they have rights, which is a right to hear. If they get a ticket to go to an event on campus and they want to hear a speaker, they have a right to hear that speaker. And so I just want to make sure that people understand that there's a difference between protected protests and unprotected disruption. Now, there's no firm line in terms of where protest becomes disruption. I think a lot of it depends on context, but we know for sure that when someone comes into a room and I have videos of this happening, comes into a room and says, I'm going to play my music really loudly so that this speaker can't be heard, that is definitely not protected disruption. Are you, Dr. Caldwell, are you showing yourself so you can share?
I am. I was going to ask the question because I thought the previous example you shared was excellent as far as the angels and them showing how the LGBTQI community should be protected, but they were actually covering some of the messaging from the speakers who had a different opinion. So was that not heckler speech? Because I could see our students maybe wanting to imitate that. And based on your definition of heckler, I wanted to know how did those two things align?
Well, I think that's a great question. And again, it's context. So I think in this case, if you were somebody who was protesting, are you still able to protest?
Yes.
You can. And the truth is probably like your signs could be seen, maybe not as clearly as one would have liked. But I think in this case, I mean, again, it depends how long it goes on for, and are they actually not being able to be, heard? They probably could still chant really, really loudly. When it comes to heckler's veto, I think you have to think, are the protesters, do they have an ability to be heard? Their speech to be heard or seen. And I think in this case, maybe they couldn't view the posters as well, but they certainly didn't stop them from chanting, didn't stop them from marching. I think in some ways, the truth is, I'm not sure that this actually really blocked the view entirely. I think it was more symbolic in terms of saying, like, we're going to help to shield you from some of these wounding words.
Okay, no, that's helpful.
Does that help?
Yeah, more clearly the spirit of the law and what the boundaries are. So that was clarifying. Thank you.
Yes, I think that, yes. But I think that's a great question. And a lot of it is really nuanced, right? The same way that if you have a speaker that, you disagree with, if 10 people come into the auditorium and hold signs that say things like they disagree and they chant for 30 seconds and then they leave, I think that's probably protected protest. I don't know. It's hard to know when exactly it becomes disruption. Some of that is going to depend on the context and also how the school responds. So like, I don't know if your school has, a protocol if an event were to be interrupted and how it's followed. Okay. So the next thing I want to do before we get to the kind of case studies is I want to talk about forum analysis. Because when you are a public university, basically the law breaks spaces down into different kinds of forums, okay? And the first kind of forum is a public forum. So a public forum is basically like your public park or sidewalk, okay? Basically, unless you're violating a noise ordinance, I could stand outside on the public sidewalk outside my neighbor's house and hold a sign and probably say pretty much whatever I want, unless I'm violating a noise ordinance, right? There's spaces that are made for speech. Most spaces are not just public forums, right? Sorry. Most spaces are something called designated public forums. Most spaces at universities, I would say, which is a space where the government chooses to allow speech, right? So at the university will say, okay, you know what? We have a quad on our various campuses, and we're going to allow people to table on that quad, march on that quad, hang signs on that quad. So basically the rule is once the government, the university opens up a space, you have to allow in basically all of the speech. You can't pick and choose, okay? And we're going to get to that. It's also something called a limited public forum, which we're going to talk less about, but I think that would be more like a classroom where the government allows certain types of speech by certain groups, right? If you're in a chemistry classroom, someone can't just walk in and start protesting about the midterm elections, right? It's limited in that you're allowed to be in that lab to learn and discuss what's in class. And then the last thing is there's non-public forums, which would be like your chancellor's office, right? You don't just get to walk in whenever you want. So the main thing we're going to focus on today, oh, good. SIU has designated public free speech forums. Perfect. So you have designated public forums. And what that means is if you are a designated public forum, it means that you have to make rules that are content neutral. And content neutral means I can't have a rule that says you can protest in the quad, but not on abortion, because that would be based on the subject matter of the content. Okay. You can't have a rule that says you can protest in the quad, but not pro-choice, because that would be about the viewpoint. Neither of those is okay. Did you want to add something, Dr. Caldwell?
I do, and I like that we're actually talking about this now, because I think I want to interject, because I feel like this is one of the biggest challenges as we try to, educate team members and even our students. We even saw one of the comments that said, Chick-fil-A being on campus, for example, could be considered anti-LGBTQIA community, and we understand based on some of their views why they may feel that way. But at the same time, it's important to note that even though we are anti-racist, anti-oppressive, we have went on record saying that by law, we still have to have opposing views. And I wanted you to talk about, when we talked about that diversity tension and just with some of the free speech laws, like how do you recommend colleges explain that to students? And I have ways to do that, but you being an expert, helping people understand that we can still be anti-racist, anti-oppressive, but at the same time, allow opposing and different opinions that might even go against some of the things that we may value and hold dear. We're not happy about it, but we still have to allow it, or we're in violation of the law. So if you could just touch on that briefly, that would be helpful. Okay, I definitely will. I'm going to just finish the rules about form analysis, and that will bring it together. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I want to go back. So it has to be content neutral, has to be narrowly tailored, and you have to allow ample alternative channels for communication. So I want to work on an example of a regulation that SIU could have, okay, for one of your public or designated public forums, okay? Here we go. Amplified sound is permitted in designated campus outdoor locations from noon to 1 p.m. Monday through Friday. Okay, so let's take it one step at a time. What is the time that is being designated here? The time that's being designated is from noon to 1 p.m. Monday through Friday. What is the place? The place is designated campus outdoor locations, and I assure you that there are definitions of what is considered a designated campus outdoor location. And then what's the manner of the speech, the type of speech? Here, the type of the speech is amplified sound. So, can you speak between 11 and 12, Monday through Friday? Yes, you can, but you cannot use amplified sound. In terms of amplified sound, does it matter what you're talking about? Nope. Matter if you're Democrat, Republican, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, left, right, center? No. All that matters, this is a perfect example of a content neutral policy. Anybody with any viewpoints can use amplified sound in designated campus outdoor locations from noon to 1 p.m. Monday through Friday.
Okay, this may seem very simple, but this is at the heart of what Dr. Caldwell was getting at, which is you can only make content neutral restrictions if you are a public university, which means that in order to allow free expression and robust inquiry and diversity of thought, you're going to have to allow in viewpoints that may be antithetical to some of the values of the institution. And it is kind of counterintuitive, but that's the way that it works. And I want to be clear to say that make sure that you understand that administrators in public universities, they don't have any choice, right? If Dr. Caldwell were to allow group A and group B and group C to pass out flyers, but then say, sorry, group D, we're not feeling comfortable with your message, they could be sued and they would lose. Okay, so they're very restricted by the First Amendment. And so that's why you have to be able to hold that space, but then also be able to use your institutional voice and do other things to say, even though we may not support these viewpoints, we believe that they have a constitutional right to be in our community, and we're going to use our educational imperative to learn how to respond to speech in some of the ways that we talked about. I want to just finish this with the time, place, and manner restriction, right? So in this case, was there a compelling purpose to limit the amplified sound? Sure. Why would we want to limit amplified sound? Because it's disruptive, right? We don't want it to be like really loud in front of the library or classrooms, right? Does it apply to everyone? Yes, it does. And it doesn't discriminate according to subject matter and viewpoint. So I'm going to give like a quick example and see if people can respond in the chat. Okay, because one of the things that comes up a lot is about security costs, and who's going to bear the cost when a really controversial speaker comes to campus and the campus needs to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make sure that person is protected. So I'll give you an example. So let's say Doris comes to campus. Doris is a very, very popular speaker. People love when she comes to campus. The tickets are sold out in a minute. And so SIU says, Doris, you're never a problem. We're just going to ask you to put down a $500 property waiver in case there's property damage, okay? So Doris comes, it's a successful event. Then Carol comes, says, student group wants to bring Carol to campus. SIU says, gosh, last time Carol came to campus or was in the area, it was really, there were a lot of protests and there was a lot of trash and there was a lot of concern about violence. And so we're going to say to Carol, you're welcome to come, but you need to pay $5,000 property waiver damage because we're afraid that property is going to get wrecked when you come. And Carol sues SIU and says that's a violation of his First Amendment rights. Does Carol win? Yes or no? And I know there's a lag, but I want to get people's thoughts, and then I will turn to this question. Get some votes on whether people think Carol will win the lawsuit. Oops. Yes. Okay. Wait, how did this happen? Here we go. The answer is yes. Carol wins the lawsuit because what am I basing the property damage waiver on? I'm basing it on the content of what Carol is saying. I'm saying you are saying things that are more provocative and people are more likely to get upset. So therefore you have to pay more. That's not going to fly. I have to come up with a content neutral way of making sure that people are safe. So an example of content neutral would be for every 100 people that come to an event, we're going to have one administrator, one law enforcement officer. So it's based on something neutral, number of people, things like that. So that makes sense. So this idea of a time, place, and manner restriction applies to everything that the university does when it's thinking about regulating public or designated public forums. Okay, I want to turn to this interesting question. It says a problem with free speech locations is that the small designated location might be nowhere near the focus of the protest, and it's a way to stick to the letter of the law, but can still be stifling. Okay, that's an excellent point, and I want to talk about that. I would like to think that Okay, good question. So let me go one at a time. Obviously, of course, people can try to evade the law. So if you have a teeny, and there have been cases like this, like there was a case, I think once in Texas, where they literally had a free speech zone that was a gazebo, like 3 miles from the center of campus. Like, okay, that's not going to work. Obviously, you have to bring a lawsuit and get sued, but I'd like to think that most of my experiences are that universities want to have disagreement and want to have engagement and events and protests. And so they usually have spaces that are open, that are close to the center of campus or to the center of protest. But whoever raised this raises an excellent point, because these are the kinds of things that come up in real life. For instance, think about abortion clinics. There have been cases that have gone up to the Supreme Court. How close or how far away can protesters be to an abortion clinic, right? Weighing the safety of women wanting to be able to feel like they can go through, right, without being harassed, at the same time, not wanting to move them so far away from the abortion clinic that their protest is meaningless. It's the same thing that happens when Democratic and Republican conventions come to cities. I remember when one of the conventions came to Los Angeles, there was a huge debate about where they should put the area for protesters. And of course, I don't remember which party it was, but the party with the convention was like, we want the protesters really far away. And the protesting party was like, are you kidding? If you put us 3 blocks away, it's not going to mean anything. So that's a great question. Okay, and then I see another question here. What if you're basing it on past damage and not the content itself? Okay, that's also an excellent question. And the problem there is that the Supreme Court makes it very difficult to restrain speech. And so it's going to be very unlikely that a court is going to allow something from the past to be proof that something will happen again. And the example I can give you is, if people remember, after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Richard Spencer, who was one of the founders of that rally, he decided to make a college tour. Okay, and as you know, in Unite the Right, people were injured and Heather Heyer died, right? And initially colleges were like, we don't want Richard Spencer to come to our campus. When he was in Charlottesville, it ended up being a total mess and people died. You can't come. And Richard Spencer went to court, and the court said, you cannot restrain Richard Spencer based on something that happened in a totally different time and place and context. So it's very, very unusual for the court to allow something like that. Now, is it possible that if there was a speaker on a Wednesday and then there was violence and then that speaker was coming back on Thursday, that might be something different. But aside from something that's connected very closely in time or the same person, the court isn't going to allow that, because ultimately they feel like that is going to infringe on First Amendment. Okay, I want to move on to a case study. And I'll read this out loud. And I know there's a lag, but we'll need people to. So imagine you are the resident advisor in a dorm on campus, and a first-year student living on your floor wants to meet with you. When she arrives, she's very upset. The window in her dorm room faces the dorm across the courtyard. The person living across the way has hung a large poster of a Confederate flag on the window. Every morning, the first year wakes up and the flag is the first thing she sees, and she believes that the flag undermines the university's values of inclusion and respect, and she asks that it be removed. The following day, someone has taken a photo of the Confederate flag and circulated it widely on social media. And you're the RA. As the RA, what questions do you ask? And what steps do you take in response to this meeting? So I'm going to give you a minute just to think on it. And people can put into the chat, what do you do? What do you do about the poster? Here are a couple other questions. I think the first question is, do you ask the student to remove her poster? I'm going to give people a minute to think it through. It's always so awkward when you're virtually. I feel like I'm supposed to like break into a tap dance, but I'm not going to do that. So I'd love to know people's thoughts on Does the poster come down? Does the poster stay up? And how do you decide? The poster is inside the room, but it's facing out. So it's a poster that can't be seen inside the room. It can only be seen by people who are passing by. It's facing outside. So I think one of the first questions, intent versus impact, ask the student's intentions. Okay, I think that's an excellent question. So I think in addition to asking about the student's intentions, and I know I'm going to sound like a policy wonk, I think the first question has to be, what is the school's policy about flyers or posters, anything hanging that faces outside of a dorm room? Okay, so there's going to be three options, right? One is you don't have a policy. Okay, the other is you have a policy. So let's say you have a policy that says nothing can be facing out. Okay, they have a rule that like you can't have any posters in your window that face outward. Okay, that would be an example of a content neutral policy. It doesn't matter if it's a Confederate flag or a MAGA poster or a Black Lives Matter flyer or an LGBTQ pride flag. The rule is if it faces out into the world, it has to come down. Now, that's content neutral, right? Doesn't matter like what it's about. That's just one of the rules. Okay. The other option can be that the stuff gets to stay up, in which case it stays up. And then the RA has to explain to the upset student why it is that we have to tolerate these kinds of things and what we can do to respond to it. And then the third option is that there is no policy, which of course becomes a problem, because if you have no policy and then you ask the student to take it down, you open yourself up to liability, because that student's going to say, wait a second, that's not fair. Everybody else has posters up facing out, but why are you only making me take mine? So that's sort of the policy issue. So I want to make sure people understand that like you can't decide in a dorm at a public university that you like some posters and you don't like others. Okay. Now, when you're thinking about the poster and how to deal with it, I think with whoever wrote that you ask the student's intention, it's like such an excellent point. I think too often people go to like wanting to have that person's head. And I think a good first step, right, is to inquire, what is the meaning of this? Like, why did you put it up? Did you know that this is having an impact with other people like in the dorm? And to have a conversation and see what happens. You know, in certain situations, I've learned like student says, oh gosh, I didn't mean it to have that impact, and so I'll take it down. In other cases, not so much. So we answered this question, which is asking the student to remove her poster constitutional? Why or why not? I think it depends. You have to be consistent with what you do with the policy and what you do with others. That's a huge part of the First Amendment is consistency, right? We're not going to treat messages differently. Someone is writing that this actually happened on SIUC campus. I'm not surprised. This happens at a lot of campuses. And I want to make sure that people understand that this scenario can be extrapolated to basically any poster or flyer anywhere, because there's generally policies about what can be hung where. So can you think of a way to create a policy that will not be content-based? So we talked about it. And then I think in some ways, the harder questions becomes what happens in the dorm. The climate in the dorm has become polarized, with people taking sides on the issue of the poster. What can be done about the climate? And then, of course, I don't think it's too far-fetched to think that the student who put the picture of the poster, so that there's all this social media attention. So now the student who put up the poster is being bombarded with nasty and threatening texts and posts. And so how do you address this issue? It's a fire hazard. Well, I don't know the rules for the fire hazard, but again, you have to have a content neutral fire hazard policy. So I think use this scenario, and then we're going to go to an even harder one because I think it shows the layers. The first question is like, can you ask the student to take down the poster? That's going to be a First Amendment question, yes or no. But after you've gotten through the First Amendment piece, then you have to deal with, in some ways, the harder piece, which is the climate piece, which is that like people are angry and upset and hurt. And how are you going to manage that? How are you going to like have dialogue? And then there's also going to be this social media component where it's maybe that photo is going to go viral, right? And there's going to be a lot of pressure put on the school. And then the student who put up the poster, whether their intentions were bad or good, potentially the way our society is, unfortunately, that person may be fearing for their safety. And so how is the school going to handle that? I'm going to just leave a moment for people to either write any other comments or questions or responses they have to this scenario. And then I want to go on to another scenario. Okay, we're going to keep going. So the next thing I want to talk about is I want to add in the layer. We talked about this, rights versus responsibilities. Okay, and just also having that be part of the discussion. Just because you're free to say whatever you want doesn't always mean you should. And I think that's part of the university's job, is to help students and staff and administrators and faculty understand, right, the consequences of what they might say. Let's add in an added wrinkle, which is this wrinkle of academic freedom, a turn. Okay, I'm going to come back. Let's see, 1 second. This reminds me of my HOA invoked a policy to have us remove our Black Lives Matter policy, but the policy was never invoked before, though others were then asked to remove all political signs. Yeah, that's a great example of them asking you to do that without, ultimately it asked them to remove all political signs. This is your HOA, Again, I think that even that rule, all political signs, because like what's defined as political. But I've seen things like that happen in other cases. Like I worked at a Jewish organization before, and there were many examples of condominium associations that wanted Jewish people to take off the mezuzahs off their door, and they were enforcing you can't take anything on your door and your door frame rule that, of course, had never been enforced. So I used to ask people who called, oh, well, go around and tell me how many other things are on people's doors, right? And then we'd write a letter and say, well, you asked, this family to take down their mezuzah, but there's, 6 flags and 3 wreaths. And so you get what I'm saying, consistency. I want to spend a minute talking about academic freedom. Academic freedom and First Amendment are not the same. They overlap. They're kind of like a Venn diagram. And so academic freedom, and they overlap a tiny bit. But I think it's important to understand what makes academic freedom a little bit different. In terms of the institution gets to decide who may teach, what may be taught, how it should be taught, and who may be admitted to study. And this definition of academic freedom is exactly one of the reasons why some of the legislation being passed by states right now is very concerning, because these states are trying to basically make the determinations about what can be taught and who can teach it, when really that is like under the autonomy of the university. And then policy. The key to academic freedom is that it's grounded in disciplinary expertise. So free speech is like, you can kind of say what you want, right? Unless you're making a threat or harassing someone. But with academic freedom, it's all about your discipline. So for instance, if I'm a planetary scientist and I decide to teach in my introductory course that the moon is made of green cheese, guess what? My department chair can come to me and say, I'm sorry, Michelle, you cannot teach that the moon is made of green cheese, because scientists in the field don't agree with that. That is not considered to be like a scientific fact. Okay, so when we're talking about academic freedom, we're usually talking about people's areas of expertise in terms of their disciplines. Okay, I'm just going to quickly tell people that academic freedom usually means freedom to research and publish those results, freedom in the classroom to discuss subjects, though you have to be careful not to introduce matters that are unrelated to your subject. So for instance, if I'm a planetary scientist and I decide that I want to bring in some information about evolution and how I don't believe in evolution, not germane to my topic. someone can come to me and say, you know what, you really can't be discussing evolution in your astronomy class, okay? Because it doesn't come together with their disciplinary expertise. But I think it's also important for people to remember that under academic freedom, AAUP is the American Association of University Professors, and their 1940 statement is sort of the end-all be-all statement. That they say that faculties are citizens, but that they also have special responsibilities. So when they speak or write as citizens, they shouldn't be censored by their institution, but they have special obligations, and they should remember that the public might judge them for what they say. So what I want to do now is I want to do a case study about speech by a professor. This is a real case study. I'm going to show you a tweet that was posted. It may be offensive to many of you. I'm just letting you know. There was a computer science professor at University of Texas, Dallas over the summer who posted in response to the spread of monkeypox, can we at least try to find a cure for homosexuality, especially among men? Homosexual men have anal sex, which can lead to a variety of diseases. Going on to quote statistics about monkeypox. So, questions and issues to consider, okay? First question is the professor's tweet protected by the First Amendment? So, can this professor or any professor go on their personal Twitter account and tweet basically whatever they want? And the answer is like, yes, probably it is protected by First Amendment because they are allowed to have a voice as citizens, okay? So let's ask the next question, which is the professor's tweet protected by academic freedom? In this case, the professor's area of expertise was computer science. This, to me, doesn't seem related to computer science. So no, I don't think they're particularly protected by academic freedom. I don't think academic freedom is really an issue in this situation. So we have a professor who has made a comment that is considered offensive by many in the community on his free time on his Twitter account, okay? But you can imagine that campus and community LGBT groups are outraged. People are calling for the professor to be fired. One, because people feel that like this idea that homosexuality is a disease and can be cured is not only offensive, but factually incorrect. And the tweet went on to also talk about ways that monkeypox could be spread, and those were actually also factually incorrect. So some factual inaccuracies and offensive. Okay, so now my question for the group is, what does the school do? And when I say school, I think it can be any group of stakeholders. You know, what does the college do? What does Dr. Caldwell's office do? What does student affairs do? What does the department do? And I'm open to your comments and feedback. And I will just say, like, there is no correct answer to this. This is just something that actually really happened. And I think now that you have sort of the foundation of the First Amendment and time, place, and manner restrictions and academic freedom, right? How are you going to think about this? Social media platform, maybe they'll take down the professor's tweet, maybe they won't. First Amendment. Okay, someone says that the speech is not protected. I think the speech is protected. I don't think that it's a threat to anyone in particular. I don't think one tweet by itself could be considered harassment. So we're going to go with that. This is speech that it's allowed. It's on Twitter. It's up to Twitter if they want to take it down or not. But this is one of those things that just because it's protected, does that mean that the university has no voice? So what do we want the university to say? Right. It's protected by First Amendment, not by academic freedom. And what are the things that we want the university to say or do in this situation? I know we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to give people 60 seconds to give me some ideas and thoughts about how you would want to see SIU respond in this kind of situation. And then I will show you what the university did, and we can think about whether it was effective or not effective. Okay, so someone wrote, the university should speak and say, while the employee is using a personal account, we don't condone the thoughts or speech of X and call it out. Okay, great. Use the university's voice to call it out. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna just in an interest of time, I'm gonna show you, acknowledge value and harms that may be imposed on the LGBTQIA students and others. Absolutely. Acknowledge the harm, and then make sure to recognize the value that LGBTQIA students bring. Can I provide the legal definition of harassment? I can. I'm going to be honest. I don't know the Illinois legal definition of harassment by heart, but I will see if I can find that before we close. All right. So I want to show you what University of Texas Dallas did. So first, the university, the college, put out a statement, says the university is aware of tweets by a faculty member that are upsetting, basically just saying, hey, this faculty member doesn't represent the school or the university. And what all of you put in, comments are contrary to the climate and culture of inclusion. They're denouncing the statements that disrespect groups or individuals. And then they're not only acknowledging that members of the LGBTQ community face challenges, and they're offering resources. Okay, so that was one. Then we have the DEI office says the university's academic leaders are conducting a review. The DEI office is focused on support the community, especially those impacted, and they're planning something called the Embrace Space, which is planned for this week, and it's meant to provide students, faculty, and staff an opportunity to build community, process feelings, and find support in an inclusive space. So we're creating spaces to come in and dialogue about the issue. Then we have someone from the chair of the computer science department making their own statement, talking again, we see about his thoughts about homosexuality on his personal Twitter account. We're appalled. We've expressed disappointment. We hear you. Our immediate response is that we're going to open up additional sections of the fall class taught by the professor to include at least one other professor to provide more options for students. So basically what the university is saying is, we understand that many of you feel like perhaps you don't feel safe or comfortable being in this person's class. And so we're going to open up another section. And I'd be curious to know what people think about this. So they're opening up different sections, and then they're even going on to talk about people outside of the heteronormative tradition have made significant contributions to STEM. I think it's just very interesting that they're like making it very about their discipline in particular. And then again, talking about the Embrace Space. So there's really like the focus on one place where people can go to discuss these issues. So I am curious what people think about opening up other sections. And Dr. Caldwell knows this is something I used at the NADHE session. And I was surprised by some of the panelists who are DEI officers. People had different feelings about opening up sections. I don't know, Dr. Caldwell, if you have a feeling you want to share while other people are thinking about it.
I know that what I might share may or may not influence how people respond. And I do recall this conversation. I actually agree with the other attorney there from Kennesaw State that the college should not have proactively opened up the sections. I think they should have waited for students to, it's one thing to express your values and make sure that you acknowledge that LGBTQIA students and allies and others are just harmed, by the information that was shared by the professor. But again, because it was not a violation of the First Amendment, the fact that the college proactively said, now we're going to open up these sections without students basically saying, we feel harmed, we feel unsafe in this class, can you open up a section? I think they were a bit rash in that decision before they got that direct feedback from students. And so I would have paused on that. And then legally, you're able to say that students requested this, and we're, again, of the legal definition, now we're responding to make sure the students have a safe space to learn. But to do that proactively is somehow them saying that he was in violation of the First Amendment. And I think that's where the college can get into some great territory. And now they're on the defense instead of the offense in this situation.
Thank you so much. I will just share that initially when I saw this as a response, I thought it was a good response. But then after hearing from others on the panel, it made me realize that, like, are we sending a message and setting a precedent that is like, anytime you have a professor who you don't share views with outside of the area that that professor is teaching you, does that mean we have to open up other sections? Because taken to that logical extension, that could be anybody. I mean, it could be about politics. It could be about how somebody feels about trans issues. It could be about abortion. And so I think it is like a very slippery slope. Anyway, there's no answer. I mean, I think I use this because I think it pulls together a lot of what we're talking about. It pulls together right. Okay. Someone wrote, he was not teaching these opinions in the classroom. So I'd be very cautious about making a preemptive decision that will put the college at risk. Absolutely. Now, of course, we could add, if we had more time, we could add in layers. So, as far as I know, in this case, there was no evidence of this professor ever bringing in these types of viewpoints into the classroom. Now, if there had been, let's say, 4 or 5 complaints in the past about him actually sharing these viewpoints, that might be different. And I think it's also important, I want to share as my last thing before we do our wrap up, I do want to share that the professor actually issued an apology. You can read for yourself whether you find this to be satisfactory or not. I show it to you because I want to raise the question of whether there is actually room for repair in our society. And I'm not asking whether this person should be forgiven or not. I'm just talking about the general idea of, like, if we're going to assume best intentions of this professor, that he really just said something inartful and that wasn't his intention, like, is there really a way for him to sort of be redeemed? And one of my concerns that I have about our culture, not just our university culture, but our societal culture, is that I don't really know that there is that room. And I think that, like, that's something that also contributes to the ongoing issues. The short answer to this is, like, his official apology kind of didn't go well, because even though he said he was trying to express compassion because he's had some homosexual friends who wish they were heterosexual, I think overall people read that as sort of doubling down on being offensive, even if that wasn't his intention. But I will let you draw your own conclusions. Okay, we're not going to get to this case study. You'll have to invite me back. I just want to wrap up by saying, embracing both free expression and inclusion and diversity is challenging, but it's fundamental to university's mission. There's no easy answers. Resources exist, use them, including your peers and colleagues. You have a tremendous resource in Dr. Caldwell's office and in the work. I mean, the fact that your university is hosting university-wide conversations of understanding is really incredible. Know your campus free speech policies, train others about them, have and facilitate dialogue across difference takes practice. One and done is not enough. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here, given that this is number 3 of 6 conversations. I just want to say it's really been a privilege to get to talk with all of you. I have learned some things from you. I hope you learned some things from me. Happy to be in touch. If there's more that I can do to help you think through these issues. And I hope that you will all go to our center website and use a lot of the free resources that are there for students, staff, faculty, and administrators. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I know we're closing on our time, but I especially want to thank Attorney Dutchman. This was super insightful, very helpful. I think it clarified some of the questions that we have legally about what is protected and unprotected speech. And I think you really clarified that, and the case studies were very engaging. And again, helped us explore and unpack these issues in meaningful ways, because again, even the flag example, we've had that exact example occur on our campus. And so we are very appreciative of your knowledge, of your expertise, and of you taking the time to spend with us today. So for those of you who are on YouTube and even on this chat, I just want to give a—
thanks.
Yeah,
So
Trying to do
And
that.
I forgot, Doris reminded me. Okay, so Dr. Caldwell put the Illinois harassment definition in, says is unwelcome conduct based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, older age. So unwelcome conduct, the hard part though, as Dr. Caldwell knows, is that you'd have to kind of go into the case law to see what are examples of unwelcome conduct. It's again, very specific. But I'm sure we could find you more information.
Yeah, actually, if I could say this, Michelle, every year, one of the things I'm very pleased with, I've been with SIU for just a little over a year, and I've worked at several universities, and we have, I would say on average, about 2.5 hours of training, and we just completed this training. So I'm not sure who asked the question. I think it's an excellent question, but not only does it provide the Illinois laws, it provides statutes, and gives very specific examples and case studies. So this is the time of the year you have until November 30th to complete harassment and sexual harassment training across the campus. So all of those definitions can be found. You can also look on the SIUE website as well as the SIUC website, and also look at Illinois law to get those very specific definitions and case studies. But I mentioned the time frame to say that this is information that we've all had to engage within the past 30 days. And SIU does a great job of making sure that we are aware of those laws.
Literally just reminded me that I need to do mine by Friday.
Yes. I completed mine. I probably shouldn't say this yesterday. I have until the 30th, but typically the deadline was the 15th. So I completed mine. But yeah, for those of you who haven't, you have until November 30th to complete that official training. And it is required and mandatory for all employees and some students who are student employees on the campus. So again, you can get more of that information. So again, I want to say thank you, and not just again, thank you to Attorney Dutchman. I know you have another commitment that you have to get to, so we really appreciate you carving out time to elevate us and be a true value add. And I also want to thank all of our team members who joined us today. And I would like to say, everybody have a great day. And please keep in mind, Conversation of Understanding number 4, based on our holiday schedule, will take place in February. So please look out for flyers and different marketing material publicizing that event. But again, thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your